Hello, this is Mr. Sarkos, and we're going to be talking about sensation and perception. We began talking about this unit in class before the break, but I think, as well as I'm sure you agree, that it's important to review some basic concepts to go through this unit. We did speak before the break about the difference between sensation and perception. Basically, sensation is a process through which we take in the information from around us. I'd like you to think about sensation as a physiological process. Through one of these five senses, we are taking in the information, but when we talk about information, we're talking about energy, whether it be something we see, something we touch, something we taste, etc. Hence, when you think about sensation, I want you to associate one word automatically, and it is energy. We are taking in energy from the world, we're inputting it in our brain through first a medium, which is one of the five senses. Perception, on the other hand, is our brain's process of organizing and interpreting this sensory information in order to give it some meaning. So I'd like you to associate that word with perception, meaning. Again, sensation, associated with energy, perception, associated with meaning. The main point here is that sensation and perception, first of all, are different processes. We tend to use them in colloquial language as interchangeably, but they are not. Again, sensation is more of a physiological process in which we're inputting energy from the environment, whether it be in form of light. In that case, we're inputting information that is visual through our eyes, something that we touch, a surface, anything that provides us with an appreciation from a tactorial point of view, and that would be through our skin, through our fingers, or any part of our body that can sort of sense something that provides us with any feeling associated with touch. Perception is, what do we make of it? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it pleasant? Unpleasant? Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? Again, this energy, we are trying to give it some meaning in a way we can understand, and this is a process that is done in our brains. The other takeaway is that sensations and perceptions are often inaccurate. Sometimes we perceive more or less than we sense. Sometimes we perceive differently than any information we sense. For instance, in the case that those two tables, which many of you were skeptical, if you measure them, you'll find out that they are actually, they measure the same, yet we are perceiving them as differently. In this case, the energy, the light that we are inputting into our system throughout our eyes is the same for all of us, yet it is the same for all of us, and it is in a particular sense, telling us that these tables are the same area in length and or in measurement, yet we perceive them as contrasting because one with each other because of their positioning, and we have ways to organize that our brain automatically organizes this information that leads us to misrepresentations of what reality is. Now, many of you, or some of you, might be asking, why are we studying sensation and perception in psychology? Well, to have a better idea as to how, as human beings, we interpret the external world, the world from which we model people's behaviors, the external world that has those groups we belong to, groups we decide not to belong to, the information that makes us who we are, comes from our reality, from our environment. To have a better understanding as to how we process all this information that makes us who we are today gives us at least a closer glimpse at what reality is. Being aware of how we sort of misrepresent or tend to misrepresent all this information that we are sensing and perceiving on a daily basis. Before we study each sense individually, it's important to ask ourselves two important questions. that are essential to studying sensation and perception. The first one is a detection question. Basically, it asks the following: how strong does a stimulus need to be for us to detect it? In other ways, as you see on the slide, what is the minimum of a stimulus we can detect? What am I talking about detect? Well, noticing that it is there, basically. And when I say this consciously. The other question we should ask is a difference question. And this one is, what is the smallest amount of difference that we can detect between two different stimuli? Or better yet, between two different levels of a stimuli. So, for instance, if we are in a room and somebody else is in charge of playing the music, how much louder does this person need to turn up the volume for us to notice that there has been a change in that stimulus, in this case, the music we are listening to? If that person just bumps it up one notch, are we going to notice that the music is louder, that notch? Or would it take 10, I don't know the measurement exactly, but 10 notches I'm going to use. Would it take 10 or 15 for us to notice this? For us to notice it. This is what I refer to as a difference question. What is the minimum difference that we can notice? And the first question being, what is the minimum stimulus? Being it either light, or being it sound, or being it something that we can touch, for us to notice that it is there. So the detection question sets out to answer, what is the absolute minimum stimulus that anyone could sense? If we are talking about light waves, then we're talking about how much dimness? Yeah, how much dimness is required for us to sense and therefore perceive it. And of course, this is a question that, if you remember Wilhelm Wundt at the very beginning of psychology becoming a science, these are the types of questions he began to ask, and then followed by a series of researchers after him. And of course, what is the minimum stimulus you can detect? So there are many variables that can interfere here. Let's say if it's a cloudy day, if it's I don't know. Yeah, if it's a cloudy day, that could, of course, that would be an interfering variable to what we could see or not. That would affect what we could see or not. But hopefully, in research methods, you all understood that scientific research has many ways to account for this. Anyway, but what researchers in psychology were expecting by asking this question is that at some point there would be an absolute threshold where below that threshold we could not detect a particular stimulus, meaning we could not see that light, we could not hear that sound, we could not touch or feel touched by a particular object or taste. And above that threshold, we could detect it, we could see it, we could listen to it, we could touch it, we could taste it. Again, above, once we were at that threshold or above it. So what psychologists found that there wasn't a definite absolute threshold, and this is something you should know and keep in mind all the time. There is no definite threshold, sort of an absolute threshold, kind of ironic that it has this title, but rather a statistical point. And what do I mean by this? Is that, let's say you are a participant in one of these studies, and you are asked to look through a device, and they were going to manipulate a particular light stimulus, a light, and ask you whether you could see it or not. So let's say that half of the times you were asked whether the stimulus was there, you said yes, and you were right. The stimulus was there. But as you might have learned so far, we cannot rely on our senses or on our perceptions or the way we organize the world 100% accurately. Perhaps there were other half of the time you did not detect this stimulus accurately, meaning you either said it was there and it wasn't, or it wasn't there and you said it was. So if you got a 50% score, to put it that way, on this test, that they were asking you whether a particular stimulus was present or not, if you got a 50% score on determining whether it was there or not, and you were right, and the other half you were wrong, leading to, hence, to a 50% score, then that would be the absolute threshold. This is how these absolute thresholds were determined. This is why this absolute threshold is many times referred to as a statistical measure, because we usually think that something that is below our conscious perception is when we cannot detect it most or all the time. But no, it's a statistical measure because it's when we can detect it accurately 50% of the time. So always remember, an absolute threshold in psychology is the minimum amount of energy in any type of sensory stimulus that is detected 50% of the time. Anything under that 50% mark, as you might see in the graph, is considered to be subliminal. And this is also important to clarify because usually subliminal is thought as something that is completely out of our awareness. Subliminal. In Latin, limen is threshold, actually, and sub, we all know it's below. So subliminal is below the threshold of sensory perception, but remember, it's 50% of the time. So we could be 50%, well, we are 50% aware of any message that can be considered subliminal, meaning that we can see it, we can listen to it. You are, as discussed in one of our classes with one of the sections, I talked about in the 80s there was this huge hype about music having subliminal messaging that would lead us to either consume drugs or to have sex indiscriminately or to with all these behaviors. And this idea was supported greatly by Christian organizations, the Catholic Church, of course, with this scandal of these, youth should not listen to these records. Yeah, well, we listened to records. I owned many of them. And because what was happening is that there was this idea of backmasking. And backmasking is a technique in which messages are hidden in a way that if you play the record the other way, the opposite way, then you could also receive some messages that was usually considered, again, related to sex or related to irresponsible use of drugs or most what was hyped a lot about was satanic, anything that had to do with satanic messaging. Now, what does this have to do with sensation and perception? Well, first of all, was it really considered subliminal? Were we aware of this messaging 50% of the time? I'm not so sure. If you want to look more into this backmasking technique, you can Google the song "Another One Bites the Dust" by the group Queen, legendary Freddie Mercury, and you'll see that backwards it's alleged to say, well, you look it up online and you'll see. So that was the first question in terms of whether this can be considered subliminal messaging. And the other question that we should ask is whether subliminal persuasion is effective. Does subliminal persuasion in advertising, for instance, does it make us buy things we don't need to buy? Does it make us carry out actions that we would not otherwise? And what research has found, and this is important because I've seen it asked in many questions on an AP exam, is that what research has found in psychology is that it does not. Subliminal messaging does not have a long-lasting effect. It does not have a direct effect on our behavior, meaning that it doesn't have this hypnotic power to make us do things that we wouldn't do otherwise. This is more related to pseudoscientific idea or pop psychology. But as with many ideas in pseudoscience and pop psychology, there is a bit of truth in them. And they have done some research on subliminal messaging, and what they found was that it does have a priming effect. It may have a priming effect. And what does priming mean? Well, it sets you up to be perhaps more open to the idea of doing something. For instance, if I can ask you a question, a leading question, and say, well, how do you feel about the terrible act of abortion, for instance, which is a controversial topic? If I ask it in that way, I am framing it so that you are primed to associate abortion with something terrible, to have a negative predisposition. That is a way. So likely, well, or there's a stronger likelihood that you will associate any further questioning or any further opinioning of abortion as you'll tend to be more on the negative side. There is a possibility because I'm priming your opinion on it. But again, this is not long lasting. This needs to occur within a particular time frame. And this is sort of how far the effects of subliminal messaging have been found in research, in psychological scientific research. Another very important concept that will likely be on the AP exam is signal detection theory. When we think about signal detection theory, again, remember we're talking about all our senses. So a signal not necessarily has to be an audible one, an auditory stimulus. Think about a moment that you and I are sitting together in a room and in a controlled environment, participating in an experiment, and we are exposed to a sound that was incredibly faint, meaning incredibly low or soft. So you and I are listening to that same sound, and let's say you could hear it. You report hearing this stimulus, and I say I could not. Now, would that necessarily mean that your senses or your auditory senses is working, or your auditory your hearing is better than mine? Well, not according to signal detection theory, not necessarily. Because signal detection theory assumes that the detection of any faint sensory information or any sensory stimuli depends not only on a person's physiological sensitivity to a stimulus, meaning the actual hearing process, the biological process or the physiological process, but also on one's decision or intention for detection that is based on non-sensory factors. Now, what does this mean? Well, that there are psychological factors that will affect our ability to detect a signal, being it through any of our senses. If in this experiment, let's say the night before, you had a good night's sleep, but I had a very bad night's sleep, dreaming about tests I need to grade, about work I need to do, and you were just coming back from the spring break, enjoying had a good night's rest. So obviously, I am not going to be as alert as you are. And or perhaps you are, let's say you say you cannot hear the signal and I say I can. Well, we could argue that perhaps you're one of these people that say, well, I kind of not buying into the psychological research at all. I just want to get out of there and hang out with my peeps and, with my homies and all that. Well, just an attempt there to be a little funny. Falling flat, of course, I know. Or maybe it has to do with your personality or attitude. Perhaps you're somebody who doesn't care about these stupid psychological theories and research. Hopefully that's not the case, but so you're not there. You don't care, right? You're not there for something. You're there to participate in the experiment and just get done with it. Rather, I, being someone who perhaps is more committed to the field, someone who doesn't need to leave that place as soon as possible, would provide. Therefore, we can assume I am highly motivated. Again, motivation is not something that necessarily has to do with the physiological process or my physiological ability of hearing. So the thing with signal detection theory is that out of many factors there are many factors that could affect or can influence significantly my ability or our ability to detect a stimulus. but that have nothing to do with the physiological equipment to detect a stimulus. So signal detection theory, basically, if you want to remember one word, think about, a term, it's not a one word, but a term, non-sensory factors, meaning non-sensory factors also can influence our ability to detect a particular stimulus. If you think about, I'd like you to think about how this signal detection theory relates to absolute and minimum difference threshold. I was reading about this example, and I think all of us can relate to it. So let's say that, just to put signal detection theory into context, let's say that you are starving and that you have, I don't know, the most delicious dessert. I think about a great piece of cheesecake, right, that only can be done in Brooklyn, and that you've been craving for months, perhaps a year, and you have finally arrived to this place. You buy your cheesecake, and then once you're arriving home, you've saved that moment to savor this, this very delicious favorite dessert of yours, and you drop it. Now, here, and then you pick it up, the 3-second rule, right? Then perhaps you're going to be less likely to notice, that you decide to eat it, right? And it's as delicious, but perhaps you didn't notice the little black specks it might have picked up from the floor, or that little ant that crawled into the cheesecake in those 3 seconds, or that you perceived as 3 seconds on the floor. You don't notice this because your motivation is affecting your ability to detect that minimal, perhaps, stimulus, being it something chunky on your cheesecake. Yeah, I know I'm getting kind of gross, but I hope it clears the point that this is what signal detection theory holds as a premise, as a concept, is that our motivations are non-physiological. There are non-physiological factors that are going to interfere, that are going to affect our ability to detect particular stimuli. But again, with the example of the cheesecake, this is our favorite cheesecake. We're highly motivated to enjoy it. We've been planning this moment. We've been investing a lot of effort, and we've been fantasizing about this cheesecake. Therefore, that motivation is going to shape our ability to notice whether some disgusting debris fell on it, because we are highly motivated to eat it and enjoy it. Whereas somebody who does not enjoy cheesecake, or perhaps just happens to have that cheesecake and it fell down, will be pickier and say, oh, okay, well, no, I'm not going to eat that. That's gross. Look at that ant crawling into my cheese. No, you have lower motivation. Again, please don't confuse this motivation with the motivation to detect any type of stimulus. It's your motivations in general are going to shape your ability, perhaps make them more aware or more acute, or less so, to detect a particular stimulus, in this case taste or a sense of touch. These are important terms associated with signal detection theory because this chart explains how this is tested. So let's say we put two people on a plane and they have to take a flight, and one of them is a nervous flyer, the other one is not. So here it's important to know the vocabulary or the terms hit, miss, false alarm, or correct rejection. This is how, again, they test signal detection theory in a controlled setting or in a field study. So a person who is a nervous flyer is going to be highly motivated because of his or her fear to notice any signals, perhaps auditory or visual signals, that can be interpreted as danger or flight. The flight has some problems. I was a flight attendant, and I know that people tend to, in fact, interpret any type of, the ring, that ringer that goes ding dong, ding dong. By the way, if you listen to 3 of them in a row, that could be an emergency. But if you don't, then it's nothing. Basically, the crew from the rear of the aircraft is calling the cockpit or something like that for something that has nothing to do with the danger of the flight. Anyway, so A non-nervous flyer is going to be less motivated to listen to any type of mechanical issues or any bells going off and on the flight. So, who do you think is going to listen? So perhaps the bell rang 3 times. The non-nervous flyer, again, not motivated to hear whatever goes on, perhaps won't notice them. But these signals were present. So you ask the non-nervous flyer, did you hear those 3 bells go on? And then perhaps that person says, oh yeah, I heard 1, but I didn't hear other 2. Wasn't it 1? This non-nervous flyer, motivation lower to detect any signals, is so by saying that he heard 1 out of 3, this person, so we can measure his response or her response. And was the signal present in that first one? Yes. And did he notice it? Yes. Therefore, he has 1 hit, right? Think about baseball for some reason. I think about that. 1 hit, and but that person also had 2. Let's see. The response was the signal was present these other two times, or was present twice, and did not notice him. Remember, he's saying he noticed 1 out of possible 3. He thinks that the bell only rang once on that flight, so he had 1 hit and 2 misses. Now, the nervous flyer perhaps noticed that there weren't 3 bells. He said, I heard 6. Oh, really? Well, perhaps that person is more motivated to confirm his or her perceptions that the flight is in danger, right? So that person, out of 3, the bells rang 3, were present 3 times, right? Were present. The nervous flyer said yes to 3, right? So he had 3 hits, but he noticed them, right? He said yes when the signal was absent those other 3 times. Again, the bells only rang 3 times, so he had 3 false alarms. Again, this is how they measure signal detection theory. I'm not completely sure, but my guess is that they usually do a pre-measure questionnaire in which they measure whatever. Let's say you're studying the threshold or the ability to detect any type of signal, auditory signal on a flight, based on your nervousness of flying. And then perhaps they make you fill out a questionnaire. Then they put you on this flight or on a simulated flight, and then ask you to notice whether you detected any type of auditory, or these questionnaires would be very specific about this. And they would measure the hits, the misses, the false alarms, and the correct rejection. Correct rejection meaning, did you hear that bell? And the bell didn't ring, and both passengers say, no, we didn't hear it. Oh, okay, so that would be they each have a correct rejection. And this, again, they're looking at false alarms and misses versus hits and correct rejection, whatever the research question is asking. So let's go back to that one of 2 questions, and the difference question, and which is the minimum difference between 2 different stimulus, 2 different stimuli that we can detect. And it's important to be clear here that about 2 things. First of all, when I talk about 2 different stimuli, I'm talking about 2 different levels of the same stimuli, meaning sound, one sound versus another sound, one taste versus another taste. And it's also important to clarify the J&D, or just noticeable difference, is the same thing about the minimum difference threshold, or the difference threshold, as you might find in your textbook. So, what is the minimum difference that we can detect between, again, 2 different levels of a stimuli? Meaning that if we play one sound, and then you play a second sound a little bit lower, can we detect it? That would be sort of a practical way of framing this question. And if so, if we can detect it, then what are the conditions under which we can actually notice this difference? So for this, there's a law called Weber's law. I'm trying here to notice it, to highlight it with. So there's a law called Weber's law, which has shown to be very accurate when it comes to this difference question. And Weber's law states that each of these types of sensory input, or types of sensory judgment, that we can make, that we can make. The difference threshold is, meaning the minimum difference we can notice, is a constant, and I want to underline this term, is a constant fraction or ratio of the standard stimulus value used to measure it. Meaning if we measure sound in decibels, then there is a constant fraction between two different stimuli in terms of the decibels each has, that can determine the minimum difference we can detect. Now, again, I want to clarify that this Weber's law it states that there is a constant fraction, and the value of that fraction depends on what type of sensory input or judgment we are making, and so that's basically it. So basically Weber's law is a numerical value that we can assign to each type of sensory input, and that we can use it sort of as a mathematical equation that can help us figure out what the difference, what's the minimal difference that we can detect. So I want to use an example here in honor of my friend Eberhard, who spends a lot of time at the gym. Sorry, Eberhard, I just had to get back at you once. I'm kidding. But let's say we're talking about lifting weights, and we want to know what is the minimum difference we can detect between, let's say we have two different weights in different arms. So let's say in one arm we're lifting 100 pounds, and I'm sure Eberhard could do this, in one hand, and then we have 110 pounds in another one. Would we be able to notice the difference between these two weights? Well, according to Weber's law, we can. And but what if we had in one arm we had 100 pounds, and in the other arm we would have 101? Well, Weber's law states that we would not notice this difference. Why? Because it happens to be that the minimum threshold, the minimum difference that we can notice when it comes to weights is actually 0.2. That's the fraction. That's the constant fraction. So we would have to multiply 100 times 0.2, and that would lead us to the value of 2. So so if we had 100 pounds in another one, we would have to have at least 102 pounds in the other arm to notice that each arm is carrying a different weight. 101 just doesn't cut it, doesn't make the cut, doesn't cross that threshold, that minimum difference threshold, or just noticeable difference. Or let's use another example. Let's say we're talking about light or brightness, and this actually, in terms of light, the minimal difference that we would be able to notice is 0.08. And when it comes to sound, the minimal difference, or the just noticeable difference, is stated at 0.05. The important point here is that to notice a difference between two stimuli, or two levels of a stimuli, I'm adding that this is not based on an absolute amount, but rather at a constant fraction, that 0.2 in terms of weight, heaviness, or that 0.05 in terms of sound. Clearly, I mean, if we had let's go back to weight. So if we had 1 pound in one hand and 2 pounds on the other, we would definitely notice a difference. But here, the absolute value of 1 does not matter at all. It's the fact that 1 is, here's where things get complicated. 1 is, we're talking about 100%. So it's basically 200%, right? It's the double. If we compared weights of 160 and 161 pounds, again, only Eberhard would be able to lift that much, it would not be noticeable. So, because again, it's not about an absolute value, it's about a fraction. In terms of weights, we would have to multiply it by 0.2. That's the fraction. And if the difference of weight meets that fraction, then that's the minimum of difference between two levels of stimuli that we would be able to notice. Basically, the main point here being that according to Weber's law, this law that establishes that we notice proportional differences, that we do not notice absolute differences, and try to avoid falling under this hindsight bias effect. It might seem very self-explanatory or obvious, but it's an important point to know when we're talking about the differences we perceive around us. So another phenomenon or another term that it's important to know in terms of sensation and perception and the way we sense and perceive, and another concept that allows us to process, that is related to how we process the intensity of stimuli, is known as sensory adaptation. This is it basically states that our sensitivity to unchanging, and I'm reading this because I want to make it very clear, is that our sensitivity to unchanging and repetitious or repetitive stimuli disappears over time. This is important to know that this is something this is a phenomenon that establishes or shapes the way we sense the world. Again, sensory adaptation is when we are upon or exposed to unchanging and repetitious stimuli, our sensitivity will disappear over time. So, for example, if we walk into a room and it smells pretty bad, after a while, it is likely to happen that we will not notice that bad smell anymore. It might be very disturbing at first, but then after a while, it kind of blends in and we don't notice it anymore. If you've been a teacher of sophomores, you might notice this, or you might know what sensory adaptation is about. Just kidding, in a way. But let's use another example. Let's say if you get on a train and you need to work. I do this all the time, try to grade, and at first people are talking, bothering me, bothering Grumpy, Mr. Sarkos, and chatting away and laughing. It bothers me so much when people are laughing for so long. Come on. Is really something that funny to be laughing about after an hour? Anyway, okay, so let's get back to topic. It might be better for us, it might bother us at first, but then after a while, especially if my motivation is high to grade, which is normally the case, because I'm a good teacher, Okay, back to topic. And kind of after a while, these sounds of people chatting, laughing, kind of blend in, and I don't notice it anymore. Well, this is why the concept of sensory adaptation is important, and because and it has its evolutionary value. Here I go with evolutionary psychology. But you can see how it makes sense that our senses, or our way to process senses, have its adaptive value. Imagine if we noticed everything all the time, then we wouldn't be able to focus on anything. We would be inattentively blind, change blind to any modifications that matter. Because if every single, we talked about all the millions of bits of information we are receiving, we are inputting every single second of our lives. If we were paying attention to everything, then we wouldn't know what is important. We wouldn't be able to selectively attend to what is important. We would be paralyzed, basically, or very non-functional. So now, at the same time, it's important to notice that sensory adaptation isn't perfect. It has its limitations. Basically, what I'm trying to convey here is that there are many stimuli for which it cannot allow us to screen out, to adapt to. For example, I talked about it in class. I know it might be my age, but I'm really not into clubs. where this, you basically can't. I prefer to talk to people, to get to know people, believe it or not. And with this loud music, I mean, it's just intensely painful. And it never subsides even after a while. So in this case, I mean, sensory adaptation is not, it's going, this the music might be so loud in a club that it's going to overpower my sensory adaptation, my ability to adapt and to just put it in the background. I remember once, and I'm sure some seniors may have come back from the Bahamas. I went once and this is where past experiences also have to have their way to shape our way we sense and perceive. In Venezuela, which in my mind has the most beautiful beaches and the best beaches on the world, I don't care what anybody else says. But I went once to the Bahamas for Thanksgiving. This was November, and the water was pretty cold. And my wife and I remember, I mean, we tried to sensory adapt to the temperature of the water, and it just never got better. It was always cold, freaking cold, and I couldn't stand it. So in that case, our ability to adapt and to just sort of enjoy the beach without paying attention to the cold never happened. We were in the water for about half an hour. It never absolutely happened. And so again, this is just to illustrate that sometimes the stimulus or the stimuli might be just too powerful and just takes over, it hijacks our sensory adaptation, and therefore it's the point I'm trying to make here is that it's not perfect. In more serious cases, very severe pain might be another example that we just cannot adapt to it. We cannot leave it in the background. And if we are sensing and perceiving a lot of pain for whatever reason it might be, in some cases our sensory adaptation process is going to be imperfect and not allow us to put that pain in the background. And think about it, this is also to support the evolutionary psychology viewpoint of sensory adaptation. If pain is too severe, it is likely that this is the only way that we are going to focus our attention, use our selective attention, remember that concept, to this pain, because it requires our efforts, the assistance of something. It requires, I mean, it's basically, this pain is telling us this problem needs to solve now. So I'm going to make this pain, the injury says, I'm going to make this pain so severe that sensory adaptation is not going to play a factor here in me going away. I am just going to be louder. I'm going to be more painful than sensory adaptation can help you put me in the background. So you better take care of this now. So it's a way that evolutionary psychology has explained when these cases happen, it has its adaptive value. It has its evolutionary mission of keeping us alive, and therefore passing our genes on to future generations.